The autumn rain painted silver streaks across the palace windows as Queen Isabella stood in her private chambers, watching the courtyard below. At 28, she carried herself with the grace expected of royalty, but tonight her shoulders seemed heavy with more than just the weight of her crown. The golden circlet sat abandoned on her vanity table, catching the firelight like captured stars. 3 floors below, Prince Alexander of neighboring Valdoria waited in the diplomatic wing, his own heart racing with anticipation and dread. The peace treaty between their kingdoms hung in the balance, but tonight, politics felt like a distant concern. What mattered was the woman who had stolen his breath 6 months ago during the spring summit. Their love affair had begun innocently enough. Alexander had been sent as an ambassador to negotiate trade agreements, a routine diplomatic mission that should have lasted mere weeks. Instead, he found himself extending his stay, finding excuses to remain in Isabella's kingdom. Their first meeting had been formal, conducted in the grand throne room with dozens of advisors present, but their eyes had met across the ceremonial space, and something electric had passed between them. The second meeting happened by chance in the palace gardens. Isabella had been walking alone, a rare moment of solitude in her carefully orchestrated life. Alexander had been exploring the grounds, trying to clear his head after a particularly frustrating session with the trade ministers. They collided at the corner of the rose garden, quite literally bumping into each other as Isabella rounded the hedge with her arms full of freshly cut flowers. The blooms scattered across the stone pathway like confetti, and as they both knelt to gather them, their hands brushed. The touch was brief, innocent, but it sent shivers through both of them. Alexander found himself staring into Isabella's dark eyes, seeing not the untouchable queen, but a young woman who looked as lonely as he felt. "Your Majesty," he had stammered, suddenly remembering protocol. "Just Isabella," she had whispered, and in that moment, the formal barriers between them began to crumble. What followed were stolen moments that neither would trade for all the treasures in their kingdoms. Secret meetings in the palace library after midnight, where they talked about books and dreams instead of treaties and politics. Long walks through the hidden passages that Isabella had discovered as a child, sharing stories of their childhoods and the burdens of royal duty. Alexander learned that Isabella had never chosen to be queen. The crown had fallen to her after her brother's tragic death in a hunting accident, thrust upon her when she was barely 21. She confessed her fears about ruling, her doubts about whether she was strong enough to lead a nation. He told her about the pressure from his own father to marry for political advantage, to produce heirs and secure alliances rather than follow his heart. Their first kiss happened during a thunderstorm, trapped together in the old tower while rain lashed the windows. The power had gone out across the palace, and they had sought shelter in what was supposed to be a brief tour of the castle's history. Instead, they found themselves alone in the darkness with nothing but candlelight and the sound of their own breathing. "We shouldn't be here," Isabella had whispered, but she made no move to leave. "I know," Alexander replied, stepping closer, "but I can't seem to stay away from you." When their lips met, it felt like coming home after a lifetime of wandering. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deeper as months of suppressed longing finally found expression. They held each other as the storm raged outside, and for those precious hours they were not queen and prince, but simply 2 people who had found something rare and beautiful in each other. The months that followed were the happiest either had ever known, despite the constant need for secrecy. They developed an elaborate system of signals and codes. A particular flower arrangement in Isabella's window meant they could meet safely. A certain book left on Alexander's desk indicated when the coast was clear. They became experts at stolen glances during state dinners, at conversations that seemed diplomatic but carried deeper meanings known only to them. But secrets have a way of becoming heavy burdens, and the weight of their hidden love began to take its toll. Isabella found herself distracted during important meetings, her mind wandering to memories of Alexander's laugh or the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Her advisors began to notice her distraction, questioning her decisions and expressing concern about her judgment. Alexander fared no better. His own diplomatic mission was suffering as he struggled to maintain the pretense of neutrality, while his heart belonged entirely to the queen he was supposed to be negotiating with as equals. His assistant had begun to ask pointed questions about why their stay was extending indefinitely, and reports were filtering back to his father expressing concern about the prince's unusual behavior. The breaking point came when Isabella's chief advisor, Lord Pemberton, requested a private audience. The elderly statesman had served the crown for 40 years and had an uncanny ability to read the political winds. He entered Isabella's study with a grave expression that immediately put her on guard. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "there are rumors circulating among the staff. Whispers about your friendship with Prince Alexander." Isabella's blood ran cold, but she maintained her composure. "Prince Alexander is an honored guest and skilled diplomat. Of course, we have developed a working relationship. With respect, Your Majesty, the relationship appears to extend beyond diplomatic courtesy. The kitchen staff reports meals being sent to unusual locations. The gardeners speak of midnight walks in the rose garden. Your personal guard mentions late-night visits to the library that coincide remarkably with the prince's own nocturnal wanderings." The evidence was circumstantial but damning in its accumulation. Isabella realized that their careful precautions had not been as careful as they had believed. In a palace filled with servants and staff, true privacy was an illusion. "What are you suggesting, Lord Pemberton?" she asked, though she dreaded the answer. "I am suggesting, Your Majesty, that you are in love with Prince Alexander, and he with you. While I understand the human heart does not consult political convenience, I must remind you of your duties to the crown and to your people." The weight of his words settled on Isabella like a physical burden. She had always known this day would come, had always understood that her personal desires would ultimately have to bow to her royal obligations. But hearing it spoken aloud made it impossible to ignore any longer. That evening, she sent Alexander the signal for an emergency meeting. They met in their usual place, the small chamber behind the library where ancient law books gathered dust and moonlight filtered through stained glass windows. Alexander took one look at her face and knew that their world was about to come crashing down. "They know," Isabella said without preamble. Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the last of his hope drain away. "How much?" "Enough. Lord Pemberton didn't accuse us directly, but he made it clear that our secret is no longer secret." Isabella's voice was steady, but Alexander could see the tears she was fighting to hold back. "So, what happens now?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "You have to leave," Isabella whispered, "and I have to do my duty to my people." "Isabella, no, we can find a way. There has to be another solution." But even as Alexander spoke the words, both of them knew they were false hope. The political realities were too complex, the obstacles too significant. A marriage between them would destabilize both kingdoms, potentially triggering the very conflicts their current negotiations were meant to prevent. "My advisors are already pressuring me to consider marriage proposals from other kingdoms," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger as she forced herself to face the truth. "Lord Pemberton has a list of potential suitors who could provide strategic advantages. The Duke of Astoria, Prince Edmund of the Northern Territories, even the aging but wealthy King Marcus of the coastal states." The thought of Isabella married to someone else, playing the role of loving wife to a man chosen for political convenience, made Alexander's stomach turn. But he also understood the impossible position she was in. As queen, Her personal happiness was a luxury she could not afford. "When?" he asked simply. "Tomorrow morning. There's a ship leaving for Valdoria at dawn. Lord Pemberton has already arranged your passage and sent word to your father that your diplomatic mission has concluded successfully." "And what about tonight?" Isabella looked at him with eyes full of love and sorrow. "Tonight, we say goodbye." They spent their final hours together talking about everything and nothing. They reminisced about their first meeting, laughed about their elaborate schemes for secrecy, and dreamed about a different world where their love could exist openly. They did not speak about the future waiting for them separately, the loneliness that would follow, or the marriages to other people that political necessity would eventually demand. As dawn approached, they made their way to the small chapel in the palace's oldest wing. There, with only the painted saints as witnesses, they spoke private vows to each other. Not the formal words of a legal ceremony, but promises from the heart that would bind them spiritually even as the world forced them apart physically. "I will love you always," Alexander whispered, slipping a simple golden ring onto Isabella's finger. He had carried it with him for weeks, hoping for a future that would never come. "And I will love you always," Isabella replied, her own voice breaking as she placed a matching ring on his finger. They kissed one final time as the sun rose through the chapel windows, painting everything in golden light. It was a kiss full of love and loss, of dreams deferred and hearts that would forever belong to each other despite the miles and years that would separate them. When they finally pulled apart, both knew that this was truly the end. Alexander would leave on the morning ship, and Isabella would return to her duties as queen. Their love affair would become a secret memory, a bittersweet chapter in their lives that would never be repeated, but would never be forgotten. 2 years had passed since Alexander's ship disappeared into the morning mist, carrying with it Isabella's heart and her dreams of happiness. The palace that had once felt alive with secret romance now seemed cold and empty, despite being constantly filled with courtiers, diplomats, and the endless parade of people seeking the queen's attention. Isabella had thrown herself into her royal duties with renewed dedication, perhaps hoping that the demanding schedule would leave no time for memories or regret. She had indeed proven Lord Pemberton wrong about her distraction affecting her judgment. In the months following Alexander's departure, she had successfully negotiated 3 major trade agreements, resolved a border dispute that had simmered for decades, and implemented domestic policies that had improved the lives of her people significantly. But success in statecraft could not fill the emptiness in her private moments. The golden ring Alexander had given her remained hidden on a chain beneath her formal gowns, a secret weight against her heart. She had taken to wearing it during important meetings and state functions, drawing strength from its presence even as it reminded her of what she had sacrificed. The marriage proposals had indeed come, exactly as Lord Pemberton had predicted. Kings and princes and dukes from across the continent had sent formal offers, each accompanied by detailed lists of the political and economic advantages their unions would provide. Isabella had received them all with diplomatic courtesy, while her heart remained unmoved. King Marcus of the coastal states had been particularly persistent, sending not just official proposals, but gifts and personal letters expressing his admiration. He was a kind man, she had been told, recently widowed and seeking a wife to help him rule his prosperous but small kingdom. The alliance would have been strategically sound, giving Isabella's landlocked nation access to crucial sea routes. Prince Edmund of the Northern Territories offered different advantages. His kingdom was rich in minerals and had a strong military that could provide protection against the growing tensions with the Eastern empires. He was closer to Isabella's age and had a reputation as a scholar and reformer who shared many of her political philosophies. but it was the Duke of Astoria who had come closest to winning her acceptance. Unlike the others, he had requested permission to court her properly, suggesting a series of formal meetings where they could get to know each other before any final decisions were made. His approach was respectful and patient, acknowledging that Isabella might need time to consider such a momentous decision. During their meetings, Isabella had found the Duke to be intelligent and well-read, with a dry sense of humor that occasionally made her smile. He spoke passionately about music and art, had traveled extensively, and treated her as an equal in their conversations, rather than as a prize to be won. Under different circumstances, she might have grown to love him, or at least to feel genuine affection and respect. But every time she looked at his kind face, she saw Alexander's green eyes instead. When he spoke about his plans for their future together, she heard Alexander's voice whispering promises in the midnight darkness. When he took her hand during their walks through the garden, she felt only the memory of another man's touch. The Duke seemed to sense her hesitation, though he politely never mentioned it directly. After several months of courtship, he had requested one final private meeting. They met in the palace's formal receiving room, with all the proper protocols observed and chaperones discreetly positioned nearby. "Your Majesty," he had begun, his tone gentle but serious. "I believe we have come to know each other well enough for honest conversation." Isabella had tensed, preparing herself for a proposal that she would somehow have to refuse without insulting a valuable ally. Instead, the Duke had surprised her. "You are in love with someone else," he said simply. It was not a question, and Isabella saw no point in denying what must have been obvious to anyone who looked closely enough. "Yes," she admitted quietly. "May I ask if he is worthy of such devotion?" The question caught Isabella off guard. She had expected anger or hurt, not this calm curiosity. "More than worthy," she replied. "He is the finest man I have ever known." The Duke nodded thoughtfully. "Then I hope you will find a way to be happy, Your Majesty, whether with him or without him. You deserve joy in your life, not just duty." He had withdrawn his proposal with grace and dignity, leaving Isabella both grateful and more alone than ever. Word of his departure would soon reach the other kingdoms, and she knew the speculation would begin. Why had the Queen rejected such an obviously suitable match? What was she waiting for? How long could a kingdom afford to have an unmarried ruler with no heir? It was during this period of increased pressure and scrutiny that the letters began arriving. The first one came through official diplomatic channels, buried among routine correspondence from various kingdoms. Isabella almost missed it entirely, might have if not for the familiar handwriting on the outer envelope. Her hands had trembled as she broke the seal, alone in her private study with the door locked against interruption. "My dearest Isabella," it began, and just seeing her name in Alexander's handwriting made her heart race, as if no time had passed at all. The letter was careful in its language, written as if from one head of state to another, but Isabella could read the deeper meaning in every line. Alexander wrote about his life in Valdoria, his new responsibilities as heir apparent following his father's recent illness, and the diplomatic missions he had undertaken on behalf of his kingdom. But between the formal phrases, she found the real message. He missed her with an intensity that made his days feel hollow. He had tried to forget, had even allowed his father to arrange meetings with potential brides, but he could not move forward with his life while his heart remained in her kingdom. He asked about her health and happiness, with the desperate hope of someone who needed to know that the person they loved was finding some measure of peace. Most importantly, he was writing to tell her that circumstances in Valdoria were changing. His father's illness had forced conversations about the future that had previously been postponed. There were new political realities emerging, shifts in the balance of power that might create opportunities that had not existed before. Isabella had read the letter dozens of times before finally composing her reply. She too was careful with her words, maintaining the pretense of official correspondence while pouring her heart onto the page. She told him about the failed courtships, about her inability to commit to a marriage that would be practical but loveless. She described the loneliness of her position and the way she still wore his ring against her heart during every state function. More letters followed over the months, each one bringing both comfort and pain. Through their careful correspondence, Isabella learned that Alexander's father was slowly recovering but had been forced to acknowledge his own mortality. The old king had begun delegating more responsibility to his son, including the authority to make certain diplomatic decisions independently. Alexander wrote about the changing political landscape across the continent. The Eastern empires that had long been a distant threat were becoming more aggressive, forming alliances and making territorial demands that concerned all the Western kingdoms. There was talk of defensive pacts and mutual aid agreements that would require new forms of cooperation between previously independent states. Most intriguingly, he mentioned that several kingdoms were exploring the possibility of formal alliances sealed through royal marriages that would be equal partnerships rather than traditional arrangements where one ruler absorbed the other's territory. These unions would create powerful combined kingdoms while preserving the independence and identity of both original states. Isabella began to allow herself to hope, though she tried to keep her expectations realistic. Even if such an arrangement became possible, there would be enormous obstacles to overcome. Both kingdoms would need to approve such a radical departure from traditional marriage politics. The logistics of ruling two separate but allied nations would be incredibly complex, and there would inevitably be other kingdoms who would see such a powerful alliance as a threat to the regional balance of power. But as Alexander's letters continued to arrive, each one bringing news of further developments and possibilities, Isabella found herself daring to imagine a future she had thought was lost forever. She began to research the legal precedents for such arrangements, consulting with scholars and lawyers who specialized in international law. She started careful conversations with her own advisors about theoretical alliance structures, framing them as academic exercises rather than specific proposals. The breakthrough came in Alexander's 7th letter, arriving on a cold winter morning that would forever be marked in Isabella's memory. His father had finally agreed to explore the possibility of a formal alliance with Isabella's kingdom, one that could potentially include a marriage between the heirs that would unite their peoples without requiring either to abandon their birthright. "The path forward is not simple," Alexander wrote, "but it exists. If you are willing to fight for our love as hard as you have fought for your people, there may be a way for us to have both duty and happiness." Isabella's hands shook as she finished reading the letter. After 2 years of resignation and carefully managed hope, the possibility of genuine reunion suddenly seemed real. But she also understood that this was just the beginning of what would be an incredibly difficult process. That evening, she requested a private meeting with Lord Pemberton. The elderly advisor had continued to serve faithfully despite his concerns about her previous relationship with Alexander, and Isabella knew she would need his support and expertise for what was to come. "My lord," she began carefully, "I would like to discuss the possibility of a formal alliance with Valdoria." Lord Pemberton's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained neutral. "What sort of alliance did you have in mind, Your Majesty?" "One that would provide mutual defense against Eastern threats, combined trade agreements that would benefit both kingdoms, and a marriage alliance that would seal the partnership." "With Prince Alexander," Lord Pemberton said quietly. It was not a question. "With Prince Alexander," Isabella confirmed. The old advisor was silent for a long moment, considering the implications. Finally, he nodded slowly. Such an arrangement would indeed provide significant advantages, both militarily and economically, The Eastern empires have grown bold lately, and a strong Western alliance could serve as an effective deterrent. But, Isabella prompted, hearing the hesitation in his voice. But it would also require delicate negotiations and careful management of other kingdoms' reactions. Prince Edmund will not be pleased to lose a potential bride to a rival. King Marcus may see this as a personal insult. And there are always those who profit from regional instability and would work to undermine any peace agreement. Isabella had expected these concerns, but hearing them spoken aloud made the challenges feel more real and daunting. Still, for the first time in 2 years, she felt genuinely hopeful about her future. "I understand the risks," she said, "but I also understand the potential benefits, both for our kingdoms and for the larger cause of regional stability. Will you help me explore this possibility?" Lord Pemberton studied her face carefully, seeming to weigh her determination against the obstacles ahead. Finally, he smiled slightly. "Your Majesty, in 40 years of service to the crown, I have learned that the heart and the head must sometimes work together rather than in opposition. If you believe this alliance serves both your personal happiness and your kingdom's welfare, then you have my support." The formal negotiations would begin within the month, but Isabella allowed herself one night to simply savor the possibility that her greatest sacrifice might not be permanent after all. She sat by her window, looking out at the same courtyard where this story had begun, and for the first time in 2 years, she felt genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. The great hall had never looked more magnificent, decorated with flowers from both kingdoms and banners that represented the new alliance being celebrated today. Representatives from a dozen nations had gathered to witness what many were calling the most significant political development of the generation. But as Isabella stood before her mirror in the royal chambers, adjusting her wedding dress for the final time, politics felt like the furthest thing from her mind. The negotiations had taken 8 months of careful diplomacy, delicate maneuvering, and more than a few tense moments when it seemed the entire arrangement might collapse. Lord Pemberton had proven invaluable, working with his counterpart in Valdoria to craft an agreement that satisfied both kingdoms' needs while addressing the concerns of neighboring states. The structure they had developed was indeed revolutionary. Rather than one kingdom absorbing the other, Isabella and Alexander would rule jointly, splitting their time between both capitals and maintaining separate but coordinated governments. Their children would inherit both thrones, creating a permanent alliance that would endure for generations. Trade agreements and mutual defense pacts were woven throughout the arrangement, creating economic and military benefits that made the marriage attractive even to those who might otherwise oppose it. But convincing other kingdoms to support the alliance had required all of Isabella's diplomatic skills and several carefully chosen concessions. Prince Edmund had been appeased with a favorable trade agreement that gave his kingdom preferred access to Isabella's mineral resources. King Marcus had been offered a defensive pact that would protect his coastal territories from eastern naval threats. The Duke of Astoria, who had graciously withdrawn his own proposal, had been invited to serve as an official mediator in future regional disputes, a role that enhanced his kingdom's prestige significantly. The Eastern empires had predictably opposed the alliance, but their very hostility had helped convince other Western kingdoms that regional cooperation was necessary for survival. Several smaller states had requested to join the defensive pact, creating a network of mutual protection that would make aggressive expansion much more difficult for any would-be conquerors. Throughout the long months of negotiation, Isabella and Alexander had maintained their careful correspondence, but they had not seen each other face to face. Both had agreed that a premature reunion might compromise the delicate talks by making their personal feelings too obvious. Instead, they had poured their emotions into letters that grew progressively more hopeful as the arrangements took shape. "Today I spoke with the Minister of Trade about grain shipments," Alexander had written in one letter. but I found myself thinking about how you used to steal apples from the kitchen when you thought no one was watching. The Valdorian delegation was very impressed with our textile production, Isabella had replied, though I spent most of the meeting remembering how you once said my hair looked like spun gold in the candlelight. Their wedding day had finally arrived, but it had not been without last-minute complications. 3 days earlier, a delegation from the Eastern Empire had arrived uninvited, claiming they wished to offer congratulations while actually attempting to sow discord among the allied kingdoms. Their leader had requested a private audience with Isabella, during which he had made thinly veiled threats about the consequences of regional alliances that might interfere with Eastern expansion plans. Isabella had received the delegation with cool politeness, making it clear that their threats were unwelcome while avoiding any statements that could be used to justify military action. The incident had actually strengthened support for the alliance, as several wavering kingdoms decided that Eastern aggression made Western cooperation essential. But now, as Isabella prepared for the ceremony that would transform her from a lonely queen into a wife and partner, the political complexities faded into the background. Through her window, she could see the guests gathering in the courtyard, the same space where she had once watched Alexander's ship disappear into the morning mist. Today she would walk down that aisle to meet him again, this time forever. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Your Majesty." "It's time," called her lady-in-waiting from beyond the door. Isabella took a final look at herself in the mirror. Her wedding dress was a masterpiece of diplomatic symbolism, incorporating elements from both kingdoms' traditional designs while remaining elegant and beautiful. The bodice featured embroidery in Valdorian patterns, while the skirt used fabric woven in Isabella's kingdom. Her jewelry included pearls from the coastal states, gems from the northern territories, and gold from the mountain duchies, representing the broader alliance that her marriage would anchor. But it was the simple golden ring hanging from a chain around her neck that mattered most to her. The same ring Alexander had given her 2.5 years ago during their secret goodbye. Today, it would finally take its proper place on her finger, where the world could see it. The ceremony itself was a carefully choreographed blend of traditions from both kingdoms, designed to emphasize equality and partnership, rather than the subordination that characterized many royal marriages. Isabella and Alexander would make the same vows to each other, exchange identical rings, and be crowned jointly as equal rulers of their new alliance. As the great doors opened and Isabella began her walk down the aisle, she saw Alexander waiting at the altar for the first time in over 2 years. He looked older, more serious, carrying himself with the bearing of someone who had grown into his role as a future king. But when their eyes met across the crowded hall, his face broke into the same smile that had captured her heart in the palace garden so long ago. The ceremony passed in a blur of traditional words and ritual actions, but Isabella was intensely aware of every moment. When Alexander took her hand for the ring ceremony, the touch was electric, just as it had been during their first accidental meeting. When they spoke their vows, their voices carried the weight of genuine love as well as political commitment. "I take you not just as my queen," Alexander said, his voice carrying clearly through the great hall, "but as my partner in all things, my equal in ruling our people, and the keeper of my heart for all the days of our lives." "I take you not just as my king," Isabella replied, "but as my companion in both joy and struggle, my trusted counselor in all decisions, and the love I choose freely with both my heart and my crown." When they finally kissed as married partners, the assembled crowd erupted in genuine celebration. The applause was not just the polite acknowledgement typical of state ceremonies, but the enthusiastic approval of people who recognized that they were witnessing something rare and beautiful. The reception that followed was a diplomatic triumph, as well as a personal celebration. Representatives from kingdoms that had been rivals for generations found themselves toasting the same alliance. Trade agreements were informally discussed over dinner, and several new defensive partnerships were sketched out during the dancing that followed the formal meal. But for Isabella and Alexander, the most meaningful moments were the quiet ones, stolen between their official duties. During a brief lull in the reception, they managed to step out onto a balcony overlooking the gardens where their love story had begun. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we had tried to fight for this from the beginning?" Alexander asked, his arm around Isabella's waist as they watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. "I used to," Isabella replied thoughtfully, "but I don't anymore. We needed those 2 years apart to grow into the people we are now. I don't think I could have been the queen my people needed if I had been distracted by worry about whether our love was selfish or destructive. And I needed to prove to my father and myself that I could put duty above personal desire," Alexander added. "Earning the right to choose love required showing that I understood the weight of sacrifice." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on the long journey that had brought them to this point. The separation that had once seemed like an ending had instead become a transformation, preparing them both for the complex responsibilities they would now share. "Your Majesties," Lord Pemberton's voice called gently from behind them, "your guests are requesting the honor of a final toast." Isabella and Alexander exchanged a look of amused resignation. Their private moment was over, but they faced the return to public duty with shared purpose rather than reluctance. They had learned that love and responsibility did not have to be opposing forces, that the greatest happiness sometimes came from choosing both rather than sacrificing one for the other. The final toast was offered by the eldest diplomat present, an ambassador from a neutral kingdom who had watched the negotiations unfold with professional interest and personal admiration. He raised his glass to the assembled crowd and spoke words that would be remembered long after the political details of the alliance were forgotten. "To their Majesties, who have shown us that the heart and the crown need not be enemies, that personal happiness and public duty can strengthen rather than weaken each other, and that love freely chosen is the strongest foundation upon which to build a lasting peace." As the crowd drank to their health and happiness, Isabella and Alexander exchanged one more look, this one full of quiet satisfaction and profound contentment. They had fought for their love across years of separation and months of complex negotiation. But they had won something greater than just personal happiness. They had created a new model for royal partnership, one based on equality, mutual respect, and genuine affection rather than mere political convenience. Later that evening, as the last guests departed and the palace grew quiet, Isabella and Alexander finally found themselves truly alone for the first time since their reunion. They sat together in Isabella's private study, the same room where she had received Alexander's first letter, and dared to hope that their story was not yet finished. "I have something for you," Isabella said, reaching into her desk drawer and pulling out a small leather-bound journal. "I kept a record of every day we were apart. I want you to know that not a single day passed when I didn't think of you and believe that somehow we would find our way back to each other." Alexander accepted the journal with reverence, understanding the weight of what she was offering him. In return, he pulled out a similar volume from his jacket pocket. "I did the same thing," he said simply. "I thought that if I wrote down my feelings, they would feel less overwhelming. Instead, they just became clearer and stronger every day." They spent the rest of their wedding night reading to each other from their respective journals, sharing the loneliness and hope they had experienced during their separation. It was an intimacy deeper than physical touch, a complete sharing of the emotional journey that had brought them to this moment. As dawn approached, Isabella looked out the window at the same view that had witnessed so much of their story. But now, instead of watching a ship carry her love away, she was beginning the first day of their life together. The quiet smile that played across her lips was not one of resignation or brave acceptance, but of genuine joy and anticipation for the future they would build together. The kingdom that awakened that morning was different from the one that had gone to sleep the night before. It was no longer a lonely realm ruled by a solitary queen, but part of a powerful alliance led by partners who had chosen each other freely and completely. The political benefits would unfold over months and years, but the transformation in their rulers was immediately apparent to anyone who saw them together. Isabella's smile that morning was indeed quiet, but it was also radiant with a happiness that had been worth every day of waiting, every difficult negotiation, and every moment of doubt. She had learned that the greatest victories sometimes required the patience to let love and duty find their own way to harmony, rather than forcing them into conflict. And as Alexander took her hand and they walked together toward their first day as joint rulers, both knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. They had proven that love could triumph over obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But now they had to prove that love could sustain itself through the everyday challenges of ruling kingdoms and raising children and growing old together. The quiet smile on Isabella's face as she turned toward the future suggested that she faced those challenges not with fear, but with eager anticipation. After all, she would not be facing them alone.